Okay, everyone. Thanks for coming back to the final presentation of the day. We're pleased to welcome Professor Christopher McNally. He joins us from Honolulu, where he is a non-resident fellow at the East-West Center and associate professor of political economy at Chaminade University. His research focuses on comparative capitalisms, especially the nature and logic of Chinese capitalist transition. He has edited 4 volumes, including an examination of China's political economy titled China's Emergent Political Economy, Capitalism in the Dragon's Lair. Please welcome Professor Christopher McNally.
Hello, it's wonderful being back in the Northwest. I've lived here for many years. I got my degree from UW, so it's nice being back in the kind of old vicinity. I'd also really would like to thank PCC, especially Tom, Deborah, and clearly Peter, everybody at the East-West Center for putting this together, for getting me over here. I arrived like 1 o'clock in the morning yesterday after one delay after another. Kind of, the United States reminds me of China. Same thing happens in China. Delays, delays, delays. As Tom introduced me, I am by training a political economist. So I study the nature and logic of capitalism quite broadly, and then in particular what is happening in China. And our last speaker, ambassador, was mentioning that the Chinese do not like to be called communist. They even less actually like to be called capitalist. The entrepreneurs do, but not the party people. So they really kind of exist in a very weird universe of their own. Perhaps we should call them Leninist, because that's ultimately what they really are. So what I'll talk today about a bit is really China's global emergence and the concept of Sino-Capitalism. Actually, what I'm trying to attempt here is to use a political economy framework to situate China's international reemergence somewhat better in our frame of knowledge. Because China is either often seen as a threat. There's various theoretical literatures on this, especially power transition theory, that says any rising power will be a threat to the existing power, in this case the United States, to the status quo power. And on the other hand, there's also a lot of... We're doing okay. Thank you. I'll pick it up and walk in a moment, but I prefer not to have to hold it. So, or on the other hand, from a more liberal point of view, China is seen as kind of becoming enmeshed in the global order that the West, especially the United States, set up, and therefore that China itself could become a status quo power, as Robert Zoellick, who's now the president of the World Bank, said, a responsible stakeholder. I think both of these views are a bit too dichotomous. They're too black and white. I think the truth really lies in the middle. I think China's rise is going to trigger some extremely complex and some very interesting new dynamics in the international system, and China is neither going to be a real pure threat nor going to be a pure responsible stakeholder. So I'll first briefly talk about China's international reemergence. A lot of that is probably known to you. I then flesh out the concept of Sino-Capitalism a bit more, look at Sino-Capitalism as it is emerging in the international system, and then ultimately how Sino-Capitalism relates to the form of capitalism that both the United Kingdom and the United States have been practicing over the past 150 years. We could call that free market capitalism. It's a bit more complicated than that, but there's some very stark differences the way the Chinese practice their form of capitalism from the way we think capitalism should work. And then finally, I actually kind of change gears a bit and talk about what is happening in the Chinese political economy at this present moment, especially about the 12th five-year plan. Yes, the Chinese still have five-year plans. They're not like the five-year plans of yesteryear. They're quite different, actually. They're quite an intelligent way of actually managing your economy. Because they're more a vision of where will we go, and the vision gets continuously revised. But there's some very interesting new policy proposals in there that can affect us immediately, indeed. Indeed, if the Chinese are successful, it will be very, very positive for the US economy, if they are successful. Now, briefly put, as you know, China has emerged in the last 30 years. This is the fastest sustained economic growth that we've ever seen in history. It's been roughly at 10% a year over 30 years. No other country has come really close. South Korea did. South Korea came quite close, but they had a real dip in the 70s with the oil crisis. China has been really more or less been able to sustain this. And you see this in 1980, China was the 11th largest economy. This is in GDP, not in PPP terms, so in pure exchange rate terms. It has become already number 2 in 2010, just overtaking Japan. And between 2018 or 2025, these are estimates, and they're always a bit difficult, China is likely to overtake the United States. Chinese economic statistics are not super reliable. Neither are actually ours in the United States. We fudge our inflation statistics quite a lot. Everybody does, actually. Nobody likes inflation. But probably the Chinese economy is about 10 to 15% larger than what the Chinese say. So rather, some people say the Chinese overstate the size of the economy, but probably because of a bias, it's quite the opposite. They understate it. And the reason for that is you've got huge amounts of gray market income in China. Actually, my brother-in-law is a pianist. He makes maybe 3,000–4,000 renminbi, which is roughly $500 US a month. He makes about 10 times as much teaching private lessons. That doesn't get recorded in statistics. That doesn't get recorded in taxes, too. Has its benefits. And then as you go down, you can see the United States will clearly remain number 2 for a long, long time. Japan will remain number 3, very important political economy overall in the global system. And then maybe we'll get India rising to number 4, but certainly India, Brazil, and Russia, the other, the brie in the brick. So not a French cheese, but Brazil, Russia, and India, the brie, will become part of the top number 10. So this will be a different world in terms of geoeconomics. Now, what I'm arguing is quite simple. What is taking place in China is not anything particularly new. It is not anything particularly exceptional, historically speaking. A lot of us who study China are blamed for always seeing China as something all onto itself, something extremely unique and obviously extremely large. China is huge. But what has been taking place in China over the past 30 years does find some very distinct and clear historical parallels to what has happened in Japan and Germany, especially in the late 19th century, South Korea and Taiwan in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Basically, it's the development of a capitalist political economy. To be more precise, for those who are perhaps within my field, this is late development with strong state leadership. It's very Gershon-Cronian. I don't know if you know the work of Alexander Gershon-Kron. If you don't, read it. It's short. His main piece is really short. And it's fascinating because it lays out how later developers develop differently in the international system because you already have pre-existing competitors. You already have large multinational companies, large industrial firms, and so you need to develop differently than both the United Kingdom and the United States did in the 19th century. Now, one of the problems, as you can already feel here while I'm talking, is that when I use the term capitalism, I perhaps mean something quite different from the way Marxists would term it. In Marxist, especially in Marxist derivatives, it's all about class structure and class struggle. Or the way people do it on CNBC. I don't know if you know Larry Kudlow, but he has everybody who comes on his show say that the best system in the world is free market capitalism. Capitalism, mind you, is not predicated on markets per se. It is predicated on capital accumulation, of which human capital accumulation is the most important. In a sense, the invention of modern education systems has been the greatest invention in capitalism, not the market system. Adam Smith was about division of labor, specialization, much more so than markets. Modern economics is actually more or less derived from Ricardo, and read Ricardo's biography. He was a stock market speculator and became very rich. Some reason, maybe those two go together. But I'll leave it here. You can ask me more questions about the nature and logic of capitalism, but it's really a system that is not, markets are important, they create competitive pressures, but it's really a system predicated on capital accumulation. Now, in a macro-political economy view, China's economic emergence is therefore generating a new form of capitalism that I term Sino-Capitalism. And with Sino-Capitalism, I mean a capitalist system that is already global in reach. Basically, China has already generated a global capitalist system. Wherever you go, there are influences from this capitalist system. And it's not just Chinatown, downtown Portland. Biggest investors in Vietnam are part of Sino-Capitalism. Just come Vietnam, there's Taiwanese, Hong Kong Chinese, as well as mainland Chinese, textile operations, toy operations that are moving big time into Vietnam, for example. But the biggest ice cream manufacturer in Mali, in Africa, is owned by a Chinese. We had a different APEC session just 2 days ago in Youngstown, Ohio, and one of the speakers, Jennifer Turner from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., mentioned how what is happening in Congo is not just big state-owned companies from China moving into Congo to exploit natural resources, but there's a lot of small individual Chinese, like mom and pop shops, that are moving into the Congo to smelter zinc. They're doing it very dirty. They're doing it in a very kind of fast and dirty and messy way, but they are there. And in and of itself, this is fascinating. I mean, you have the influence of the Chinese diaspora, Chinese state-owned companies, all together globally. And the system, as I will explain in a moment, differs from Anglo-American capitalism very much. But before I get to this, I just want to point out the historical significance of China's international reemergence. Basically, the global system since 1850, since the birth of modern globalization, was predicated on Anglo-American capitalism, a system predicated on the free flow of goods and services, the free flow of capital, very important, free finance, and the free flow of migration in its first phase up until 1914. You could very easily migrate before 1914. Ever read Around the World in 80 Days? No passport controls, no immigrations, no visas, nothing. So you had this system that was very much predicated on the Anglo-American concept of capitalism as one with a minimal state, ideally a night watchman state that regulates but really keeps out of the economy, that allows enterprises, private enterprises, and market forces to allocate goods and services. Sino-capitalism is different, but it is the first time that we're seeing on a global scale the rise of a continent-sized, and you see this is a nice purple, continent-sized capitalist power. Why did I put this there? Because yes, we have seen the rise of Germany and Japan before. These were very important capitalist powers, but they had never had the potential to affect the global system as much as China. China is not Germany or Japan. It is much, much larger. Even actually the United States is dwarfed by China's size. If you ever travel in China, the amount of people, the size of the country that you feel there is really quite incredible. And naturally, the Communist Party uses that because they build huge infrastructure that then makes it seem even bigger. By the way, I was quite intrigued. I was in Guangzhou about, 3 years ago. And before, when you were in China, the Chinese had their flags. And they had the flags kind of in a rather European, though the French are not like that, kind of a very normal flag size. And that's the only size you saw the Chinese, 5-star flag. But then I was in Guangzhou airport, and they had this huge Chinese flag hanging, on one side of the airport. And I thought, okay, they've learned something from the Americans. Although the Mexicans have even bigger flags. Must be some competition going on there. Anyway, Sino-capitalism, yes, is a state-led form of capitalism, but one of its defining characteristics is actually network capitalism. Because bottom up, you have a myriad of small and medium-sized enterprises that are driving the development of China's private sector and ultimately its manufacturing. Some of these companies are hybrid owned, meaning they have some state influence. Could be local state influence, provincial, sometimes even central, but mainly local. In some cases, these private enterprises have become very large, like Huawei and ZTE. These are network telecoms equipment providers. Overall, these networks rely less on legal codes and transparent rules. They rely on what the Chinese call guanxi, or just more broadly, interpersonal human relations to do business. And that is basically because the Chinese system is not very well institutionalized. You can't really rely on the law and on lawyers. Indeed, all the lawyers I know in China, I ask them, what do you do? And they say, oh, we don't do law, we do guanxi. You know, we are basically middlemen that kind of pull strings and get this person to know this person so things get done. So it's very much a form of network capitalism that is highly dynamic, highly entrepreneurial, and highly globally enmeshed. So very different from what we imagine state capitalism to be. Nonetheless, Sino-Capitalism assigns the Chinese state the leading role in fostering and guiding capitalist accumulation, what you would term state-led or state-coordinated capitalism. And ultimately, China is a large developing economy, still at a very actually low level of development. Per capita GDP is roughly $4,500. So this is a tenth of the United States. That has a distinct socialist and imperial legacy. And I'll come back to history in just a moment. Now, bottom up, the network character, as I already mentioned, imbues China with a highly entrepreneurial and flexible element. These companies can sometimes cluster. There are some fascinating places in China where you find hundreds, if not thousands, of companies producing the same thing. For example, lighters. There's, if anybody smokes, you have a lighter. About 80% to 90% of all lighters in the world are produced in a Chinese city called Wenzhou. And originally, these kind of families started each producing lighters. They had miserable quality. That was in the 1980s. And over time, they split. And some families started to produce just the plastic casings, other the firestones, other the metal casings. Others put them together and inserted the gas, and yet others marketed them to companies like Walmart. And so very fine divisions of labor, very kind of Smithian, very Adam Smith, emerged that have produced enormously competitive industrial clusters that have taken over world markets. There's another city in Zhejiang, Wenzhou is in Zhejiang, like Shenzhou, that is called the Necktie City. Probably this was made there. And they've been clever. They've actually hooked up with fashion houses in Milan, in Italy, to get the designs immediately sent over via the web, produce samples, FedEx them to Milan. If they're approved, they can produce the necktie within a week and have them in stores. Basically, from design to having them in the stores in Europe takes about 2 to 3 weeks. Enormously fast turnover. And they also produce about 70 to 80% of all silk ties in the world. So this is something that we don't necessarily associate when we hear, especially in the press, that China is state capitalist and it's all the state. China has a very large, very dynamic, small, medium, sometimes large enterprise sector that is privately owned. And this element integrates Sino-Capitalism into global production and knowledge network. So China very much is part of global capitalism. Now, on the other hand, top down, so you really need to see the system as almost kind of predicated upon a very unique duality. My German friends always said, don't use duality, use dialectic. I said, yeah, but then people in the US will think I'm Marxist. But dialectic is probably a better word. But duality works as well. So you have the socialist-Leninist legacy of China's capitalism. Sino-capitalism implies a state-sponsored form of capitalism with a very large and significant state enterprise sector. Chinese state-owned enterprises are the largest enterprises in China. The top 10 enterprises are all state-owned. And by the way, they're the largest enterprises globally by now. So the largest 4 banks by market cap, not by global trading, but by market capitalization now are the Chinese 4 big state-owned banks. The same goes for Chinese oil companies, mining companies, and quite a few other sectors. So basically the commanding heights of the Chinese political economy are owned, majority owned by the state. And so from a political economy point of view, state hegemony by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is very much used to foster economic expansion, which then in turn aids the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. And so there's this kind of positive feedback loop, imagining like somebody who rides a bicycle and you can't fall off. That is the Communist Party riding a bicycle, and the speed is the speed of economic development. So once the speed slows down, they know they can easily tip over, and they're extremely scared of that. There are some historical parallels to this. This is not growing up in a vacuum. This is growing up with both global and historical influences. And especially if you look at the political economy of China from roughly the late Song to Qing dynasties, so that's about the 13th century to the very early 20th century, what you had is a dominant state, subservient capital and middle classes, and really no separate sphere of the economy. What I mean with this is that in the United States, we see the economy as in many ways self-regulating. This has never happened in China. The economy has always been a tool for the state. It's a means. It's not an end in and of itself. There are no libertarians in China, put it differently. Indeed, the Tea Party will sound very abstract to the Chinese. You explain it to them and they just, no, how can you do that? You need a strong state. And Japanese and Koreans would react exactly the same way. I mean, a strong state is very much embedded in the conscience of Northeast Asians. And this is roughly the way the system looked like. The tributary state was kind of this umbrella lording over the political economy. You had small-scale merchant capital that, mind you, was at times very powerful locally and very, very rich. But these small-scale merchants could not flaunt their wealth. It was something that was frowned upon. They could not rival the state. If they rivaled the state, they became dangerous and the state would clamp down. So you can go to some of these rich merchant cities. They're actually called water towns around Shanghai. I don't know if you've ever been there, Zhouzhuang and Xitang. Xitang is actually the place where they made Mission Impossible 3, I think. You see poor Tom Cruise running around. It is a fascinating place to visit. There's a lot of pictures of Tom Cruise, but otherwise it's quite nice. And you can walk by the facades of these merchant houses, and the facades are extremely simple and inconspicuous. You cannot know how rich the family is that lives behind there. But then you go in the door and you go through a small courtyard, and yet a bigger courtyard, and yet a bigger courtyard. And ultimately you reach a big garden that is all enveloped in this merchant house. And what merchants did is basically they tried to split their wealth into many pieces, which you could in China because all sons inherited equal amounts. This is different from Japan. And you could also do that because it was a polygamous society. It was quite easy to have a lot of offspring. And then you educate your sons to become part of the tributary state, to basically do the imperial examination and become imperial mandarins. So there was this continuous flow from wealth into power. And this is something that is actually quite parallel to now, because a lot of rich Chinese do two things. They've got two strategies to protect their property rights. Strategy number one is to associate themselves, or indeed embed themselves, with this party state. Become members of the National People Congress, become members of the party, become members of the CPPCC, which is the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. What a mouthful. Only communists come up with that, but I think APEC can do so as well. And the second method, you probably have seen a lot of this here, is to get a green card or a PR in Australia. Basically, send your wife and kids abroad so that they have a residency in a country that protects property and put some of your money over there. So this is still, in a sense, very much a system that is emerging. This is another way of looking at what I had here, but in a more modern, contemporary way, nonetheless very abstract. So anybody who's a historian, please bear with me. But what you see is that private capital here, I've got a pointer here. Private capital has a very kind of narrow base, but nonetheless reaches high up. I mean, it's very powerful, but it's got a narrow base. The state is enormously powerful. This includes the very large state sector, and yet the market is also very powerful. China is an enormously competitive political economy, except in those areas where the state forbids it. And there's a lot of oligopolies in oil and gas, as well as in telecoms, that are basically state-guided. Chinese citizens complain continuously of a phenomenon I'll talk about in a moment that is called 国富民穷, which basically means the government's rich, the people are poor. I think we Americans could kind of almost say the opposite. But there's a very strong market, especially for anything from electronics to textiles, even in a lot of services, restaurants, etc. And then you can see that civil society still remains really quite weak. It is growing, it is becoming more important, but it is under the state. I made this very clear that the state kind of still lords over it and keeps it constrained. Now, all of this means that, in a sense, China's transition in its internal political economy remains incomplete. This is the maturing of a capitalist political economy, because one of the hallmarks of capitalism is constitutionalism. And the logic is very, very simple. If you own property, you want your property to be protected. How do you protect it? The best means, something the British invented, is the rule of law. You have an autonomous judiciary that basically can find in favor of whoever is legally right. It doesn't always work perfectly, but it works actually stunningly well. It's one of the great innovations of humanity. And this partially has been kind of developing in tandem with capitalist development and is one of its hallmarks. Even, let's say, Singapore. Singapore, most people would argue, is not a liberal democracy. Most people even would say it's not a democracy. But Singapore is constitutional, that's for sure. Unless you say something bad about Lee Kuan Yew, but you can get into problems here in the US as well, saying bad things about certain people. So what you have is really insufficient legal and institutional certainty, no constitutional state. It's a Leninist system of governance that continues to shape China's political economy. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, yes, China neither is really communist, I think it is capitalist, but it is certainly Leninist. By the way, if Lenin would have lived today, he'd be probably one of the top paid employees of McKinsey. Because he was an organizational genius. He was really good at, knowing how to structure organizations, especially highly secretive revolutionary organizations. Now, Sino-Capitalism, although having this historical antecedents, is emerging in a global system. And this global system is really, we're in an era of unbridled globalization. The world has only seen this once before, roughly starting in the 1850s, really picking up in the 1870s, and then leading up to 1914. As you can see, it didn't end well. And we're kind of entering again a period very similar to that before 1914. Some people compare it to the 1920s, makes sense as well, and I'll come back to that. But China's rapid economic growth has taken place in this highly globalized era. China has faced enormous international competition. This is very different from the late Song to the Qing dynasty period, when the Chinese imperial government saw itself as the Middle Kingdom without any competitors whatsoever. Didn't work out well. But China does not see the world this way. It sees itself as one player amongst many, and that it has to compete, and that it also has to integrate globally into existing norms and rules, especially as you can see, for example, with China's entry into the World Trade Organization. These have conditioned Chinese policies to a considerable extent. So China's economy today depends on a healthy global economy. China is part of the global capitalist system, but the global economy also depends on China. Just some very brief quantitative illustrations, or actually what we try to do is portray something graphically in a relatively nice, elegant manner that it works. And let me kind of step out. I have to take this away, otherwise somebody's going to come running up here. But what we did is basically quite simple. We said... It really isn't. Listen. So in this case, we said there is a group of countries that we will call industrializing Asia. Most of them are in ASEAN except South Korea. And industrializing Asia is comprised of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, Vietnam, and South Korea. So we excluded Cambodia and Laos and certainly Burma or Myanmar. I have a State Department person here who said Burma. Because they're really not industrialized. Maybe Cambodia now, we could start to integrate. And we said that these countries, this group of countries, trades with four major trading poles. So we said there's kind of four major forces of gravity that pull in one direction or another. And those four major forces of gravity, those four major trading poles are Japan, the European Union, the whole European Union, the US and Canada, meaning North America, and then China. And we basically took the year 1992 as a starting point and just mapped it here on this radar chart. And as you see, all of this group of countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., almost 20% of their trade was with Japan, 50% with the EU, 20% with US and Canada, biggest poll, and only 2.9% with China. Fast forward 18 years, and the picture totally changes. From what was a flat triangle, we emerged with a very nice deep diamond, very nice diamond cut. You can see that the EU, Japan, and the US almost are equal. They're all around 10%, but China's up at 16.5%. So this is really a major geo-economic transformation of the way industrializing Asia trades. Now you might say, okay, Asia. Asia is very close to China. There is a Chinese diaspora. There's a lot of interlinkages that are on a personal, even ethnic level. So it's to be expected. So we took another country, Brazil, about as far away from China as you can get, and did exactly the same thing. You again have Japan, the EU, US and Canada, and China. And what happens is very fascinating. We got this very flat, a very different type of diamond cut. The EU clearly is the biggest trading partner and has remained so at 30%, going down to 21.5%. Japan, always not very important, at 6% has actually come down to 3.7%. Interestingly, the US and Canada, North America, that is really adjacent to Brazil, has gone from 22.7% down to 13.6%, while China has gone from a negligible 0.9% to 14.7%, now being number 2 after the EU. This is Brazil. It's a long way away from China. A lot of the trade is in commodities. Brazil exports soybeans and iron ore to China, and will start to export a lot of oil and gas as well, and a lot of manufactured goods from China to Brazil. But it's nonetheless stunning. We did the same thing for the Gulf states, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman. You get the same pattern. We did the same for India, which didn't look very elegant because the EU is too large. So the EU is just, even here, Europeans. I grew up in Switzerland, by the way. We're not part of the EU. But you really get a very, this kind of this diamond, going from what is basically, put this back here, going basically from what is a flat triangle to this diamond shape happens everywhere globally. We also did South Africa, happens the same thing again. So what you see is China rapidly emerging as either the second most important or the most important trading pole for all emerging economies. So this is an emerging economy development, and in a way the growth of emerging economies is directly tied to the growth of China. It's very much interlinked. Even India, who you often see as a competitor to China, India's biggest trading partner is now China. India exports a lot of iron ore. India has wonderful iron ore, some of the best in the world to China. China exports a lot of manufactured goods. By the way, there's an anecdote from an Indian colleague of mine. It was about 8 years ago, and he was back in India with his friends, and he went out to buy a toy for his son. And what he thought, I'm just going to get him a tennis ball. The simplest toys are the best. And got a tennis ball, and tennis ball said, made in China. And he talked to his cousin and said, oh, how interesting. Even tennis balls are made in China. And his cousin said, yeah, probably not. It's probably made in India. They just put made on China in there so that they can sell it for more money. So, but that might have changed as well in the meantime. But actually, Chinese goods overall have a decent reputation. Now, finally, what we did is we looked at this. These are all actually from IMF statistics. We looked at how much do the United States, we also looked at the European Union and others, but especially the US and China, contribute to global growth. So this is not how large are they in absolute terms. No. This is like if the global economy is a horse carriage and you have 6 major horses pulling it, which is the biggest horse? And throughout the post-World War II period, the United States was the biggest horse. It went up and down. The data series is quite volatile. But what you see in 2000, this is the last year the United States grew at 4%. And the United States contributed more than 60% to global growth. China at 10%, respectable, but not very large. 2001, we had a negative growth year, so we cannot run the numbers. And then from 2002 onwards, you can see the United States is consistently larger, almost triple to double the size of China. And then all of a sudden in 2007, even before we enter the so-called Great Recession, China contributes more to global growth than the US, just a bit above 10%. Then in 2008, clearly it contributes almost 3 times as much as the US. And then this is a negative growth year again. In 2010, you see that China already contributes about 20%. The IMF just came out this year and said in the first half of 2011, China contributed a whooping 33% of global growth. So a third of global growth is now driven by China. This might not be sustained. China's economic growth cannot continue at such a high speed as it has before, but nonetheless it is impressive in the sense that China already has become the biggest motor for global growth. It already has overtaken the US in that respect about 4 years ago. So this is just some kind of illustrations, trying to put them there of what this means. Now, since roughly 2000, the United States and China actually in the economic realm have formed a symbiosis, have formed a highly collaborative, cooperative, even one might argue deeply enmeshed relationship. And what the United States got out of this was basically low inflation, high corporate profits. We had this question at the last session about labor. Certainly one could argue that a big chunk of US labor actually hasn't been doing so well. Indeed, if you look at growth in the United States from 2000 to 2007, all the growth has happened in the non-tradable sector. Things that we cannot easily trade across borders, such as construction, government, and certain services. Wherever you can trade across borders, the United States has not fared well between 2000 and 2007. This might change. As the ambassador mentioned, a lower dollar is really starting to help us. And we're seeing onshoring. We're seeing a new trend of bringing stuff back to the US because they can be done here better and control can be better. But nonetheless, this system basically, the United States got low inflation. It is the Walmart economy, high corporate profits. China got growing employment, growing trade, rapid capital accumulation. This is kind of expressed by these enormous, humongous, I should say, reserves under the People's Bank of China. They were just about 3.2 trillion at the end of June. This is an enormous amount of money. It's very difficult to fathom. But if we had that money to invest in the United States, our unemployment rate would be down at 5%, and we would have world-class infrastructure. Now, the Chinese invested here in the United States, so it's up to us what we do with it, so partially. I'll get back to that. And growing technological sophistication. Some commentators have said we can term this chimerica, this system. Because indeed, what was going on is that the financial flows between the United States and China were on a scale that historically has only occurred within nation states. So flows, let's say, from Los Angeles to New York, or from Houston to Boston. The flows between China and the US have been so large that we really generally only find them on the level of the nation state. But this marriage of economic interests might be coming to an end. Some, indeed, those who have coined this term, this is Moritz Scholarek and Niall Ferguson, are saying that we're heading for a divorce. In my opinion, we are in a marriage. It is a very difficult marriage. But unfortunately, we're in a Catholic country where you can't divorce. Because we're really in a situation where if we divorce, we're going to destroy each other mutually. Larry Summers, who has had many government positions, somewhat infamously at times, also president of Harvard, even more infamous, did actually coin a very, very intelligent term. He termed this basically mutually assured financial destruction. That's what we have. Anybody in international relations will know about nuclear weapons being mutually assured destruction. We're in a mutually assured financial destruction system. Okay, we can't pull the rug under from the Chinese, and they can't really pull it under from us because we're just going to have a Pyrrhic victory. We're going to destroy ourselves. And this is basically the way the system looks like. And if you look at this, you will see, quite nice, you know, China loans us money and the United States buys Chinese goods. And by the way, it's not such a bad deal for us because the Chinese loan us money, which is basically a zero interest, even a negative interest loan. We repay them less than they gave us. because we are devaluing our currency constantly by inflation and by the revaluation of the yuan. So this is not a very good deal for the Chinese, and people on the Chinese blogosphere have picked up on this. They're saying, why are you giving all this money to these consumerist Americans? We've got all these poor people here. Give it to them. So this is a very raw issue. I've heard many Chinese say Wen Jiabao, the premier of China, does not sleep well at night because he does not know what's happening with the money, and they're very scared of losing it. But the problem underlying this is that China accumulates more and more capital in this system, and the United States more and more debt. And as we know, this cannot be sustainable. Something has to change. Ideally, by our own volition before it's too late, and we really end up with a catastrophic situation. Basically, we never want to become the United Kingdom. Don't forget, we and the British are almost like brothers and sisters. That the Americans did not treat the British well when they were in debt to us. There's a long, very, very bitter history there. Keynes himself was extremely bitter about that. But that's history. So basically, the system I think that is emerging, at least in the next 10 to 20 years, is Sino-Capitalism versus Anglo-American capitalism. We are seeing increasing tensions in the US-China relationship, but yet we're so closely enmeshed with each other that it's very difficult to work through them. And especially since the financial crisis, the Chinese have become a lot more self-assured about themselves, about their power, about who they are in the international system, and they're starting to make that power felt. Cautiously, but if you're Vietnam, it is not fun. I mean, it's not fun living next to China. You know, it's not fun living next to the US. Understand? You know, so far away from God and so close to the United States. Yeah, you couldn't tell that the Vietnamese next time. They'll sympathize with the Mexicans very much. So to quote from the Financial Times, it is a discomfiting historical fact that great power shifts in the global economy are dangerous. They have tended to coincide with extreme financial dislocation, currency turbulence, and trade friction. Kind of rings a bell, increasingly. Basically, US-China relations in the economic realm especially are undergoing a rapid power transition. This does not mean the United States is declining. Be very careful here. It's meaning that we are moving into a more multipolar world where the United States will have an economic competitor of the same size, but at a much lower level of development. This necessitates both sides to review their policy positions, but the problem, and this is where my conceptual framework comes in, is that Sino-Capitalism, the form of capitalism China practices. Now, China practices capitalism, and that makes China very different from the Soviet Union. It means that we are deeply enmeshed with each other, but yet the two systems differ deeply. And it espouses different values, international viewpoints than those characterizing our system. There's less emphasis on legal norms and standards, more emphasis on interpersonal relations built on reciprocity, human empathy, and trust. Again, guanxi, very bilateral in a sense. And perhaps even more importantly, there's less trust in markets. The Chinese deeply, the people and the government, distrust markets. So do Europeans, by the way. Talk to the French, talk to the Italians. There's much more trust in the state and social norms of stability and hierarchy. So this is a very different view of how the economy should work within China and how the economy should work globally. If China ever becomes very powerful, it's likely that they'll gradually try and constrain international finance the way it exists nowadays. And you can see that with the way they're internationalizing their own currency. It's a very cautious, very state-controlled process. And the currency issue is one very clearly, because the Chinese control their currency. They don't think that currency values should be left to markets. And if you look at it historically, they have a point. Emerging economies that have left their currency value basically defined by markets have not fared very well. They have experienced enormous volatility that has wiped out manufacturing sectors in one fell swoop. So the Chinese believe we need stability. And indeed, this is kind of the credo of the Chinese Communist Party. We might call them the Stability Party. I'm sure that if you went to them and say, you're not communist, you're stability, and they say, yeah, that's what we are. We're these neo-Confucianist stability freaks. What they really want is social stability above all else, and currency policy is basically a means to an end, the end being social stability, the creation of employment opportunities, the creation of export opportunities. And there's little regard by the Chinese Communist Party for what this currency policy does abroad. Really, I mean, they are selfish, straight out. There's, by the way, very little regard by the United States what our policy does for the rest of the world. The Federal Reserve embarks on quantitative easing. Nobody in the United States, you know, there's a lot of people who die of hunger because of this, but nobody in the United States really cares about that. And I can talk to you about the transmission mechanism if you want to hear more. I don't want to throw things out that are somewhat, you know, and then not explain them. But the Chinese really don't care much about global imbalances. Only now are they starting to revalue their currency, basically because it's creating massive inflationary pressures in China. So now they're actually much more flexible. The other side of this coin, it's really the flip side of the same coin, is the accumulation of reserves. Chinese foreign reserves are excessive, clearly excessive. But the Chinese Communist Party, although it always complains about the stability of its reserves in the US, actually likes it. It likes the stability and the influence that this brings with it. And it does not mind low returns. As I just mentioned, the money that China has loaned the United States basically creates negative returns. Okay, it is not positive returns. But this is a state-led system. It's not a market-led system. And so the government, the party state, does not mind this. And this is just kind of illustrations of the way Sino-Capitalism is emerging as a very, very different system. All of this implies that the world will be faced with a massive political economy that is a developing nation with a very different form of capitalism, and that we are, in a sense, entering the age of uncertainty. And it will be with us. Don't watch your 401k every day. It will not be fun. Okay? Diversify. Do good portfolio management, and invest in American companies that are globally active. And you probably will do quite well. But we will be seeing basically three major forms of capitalism rivaling each other and vying for global economic leadership, especially in the philosophical, in terms of precepts. One is Sino-Capitalism, the other is Anglo-American capitalism, and the third one is what we might call Rhineland, Alpine, or Northern European capitalism, which, by the way, has been doing very, very well. It's the other part of Europe that has not been doing well. But if the Germans get their way, all of Europe will look like Germany. This is actually the problem of the euro, by the way. Germans want Greece to behave like them, and it doesn't quite work. But if the Europeans get their act together, which I actually personally believe they will, they have to almost, Europe will emerge as a much stronger force because it will be economically much more centralized than it's been before. But that is for another day. So now to the future. There are some positive things. My whole description of what is going on has some influences from actually a French author. His name is Michel Albert. He was the CEO of Assurance Générale, which is a very large French insurance company that I think now has been renamed. And he wrote this book in 1993 that is called Capitalism versus Capitalism, Capitalism versus Capitalism. So a lot of that kind of philosophically is where I come from. It's not that the world will go under. It just means that we are facing a totally new form of global philosophical, in a sense, ideational competition. It's not Marxism versus capitalism. It's capitalism versus capitalism. It's kind of a fraternal struggle. But there are some positive things, because the Chinese themselves are trying to revamp their political economy. Basically, rebalancing China's domestic political economy is key to solving various challenges that could, if solved, create a sustainable base for Chinese economic growth. Now, the Chinese have studied very carefully, basically, three things. The first is the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. They want to avoid that at all costs. The second is Scandinavian models of social democracy. They'd love to be like Scandinavia. And the third is the Japanese bubble and what I call the Great Stagnation. It's not really recession, I think it's stagnation, because actually Japan hasn't been growing at all. It's been growing just very, very slowly. On a per capita basis, it actually hasn't been doing so badly. But they really would like to avoid the Japanese scenario at all costs. And that means moving from an export-led model and an investment-led model to a domestic demand, domestic consumption-led model. And this is key to diffusing social and regional contradictions in China, and key ultimately to addressing global imbalances, including the currency issue, which continuously is on the radar of China-US relations. And I think the Senate will be voting on a bill just next week yet again. So China's political economy is at a very crucial threshold. This is key. These next 5 to 10 years are crucial for China to make it out what is kind of a lower middle income country to a lower advanced industrial economy, to kind of graduate with a bachelor's, not a master's, a bachelor's. As I mentioned, China has been building up an investment, export, and state-centric development strategy, and the 12th five-year plan, as well as a slew of recent policy measures, really constitutes a new policy framework. Let's put it like that. The Chinese are very good in setting up visionary policy frameworks, much better than we Americans are. Just look at our healthcare bill, 2,000 pages, or Dodd-Frank. They have very clear visions. The problem is always implementation. Once you start to implement things in China, it gets messy. Now, imbalances. Very briefly, what are these imbalances within China that I'm talking about? I already talked about kind of the global imbalances between the US and China. But within China, the major one is, as I mentioned before, rich government, poor people. 国富民穷. And what it means is that if you look at China, a lot of the savings that have been occurring, there's always this idea that it's the Chinese households that are saving so much. And yes, Chinese households have a savings rate of roughly 38%, which is stunningly high. We in the United States are at 5%, and we feel, oh, we're being frugal. Now, the 38% probably is lower because, as I mentioned before, a lot of Chinese don't declare their income. If you're a university professor in China, you make a miserable salary. But you can make 100,000 yuan, 15,000 US dollar for one appearance, and you don't pay taxes on that. So there's huge amounts of gray market income in China that does not get wrapped into that, and so that changes basically, income is underestimated, and therefore we get a very high savings rate. But most of the savings in China are happening in the government sector. The Chinese government has been saving money aggregately. More importantly, the Chinese government's corporate interests, the state-owned enterprises, have been saving money like mad. Actually, our corporations are doing the same thing. They are the ones that are really saving nowadays in the US. But there's been huge amounts of profits accumulating to the state sector and also partially to the private sector, and that has led to rising income inequalities, what we could call a wage-profit imbalance, where wages are low and profits are very high. And there's an industrial structural imbalance. Basically, there's not enough value added being produced in this economy. There's not enough technology and know-how in the goods that China produces. So, rich government, poor people, saving consumption, and rising income inequalities are all linked. It's all, in a sense, part of the same package. And that also plays into rural-urban imbalances, because urban areas have been growing very rapidly and rural areas have stayed far behind. Rural incomes are roughly a quarter of what they are in urban areas. This is one of the largest differentials globally and historically. And you get a rich coast, poor interior imbalance, meaning that the coast is very rich and the interior is poor, though that is changing. That I actually would already argue the Chinese government has been quite successful in addressing, because several interior cities like Chengdu and Chongqing are growing like mad. I was in Shanghai, and the thing you do in China, you can talk to investors, they all do the same thing. They count the cranes, crane counting. In Shanghai, crane counting has become easy because now it was roughly a dozen. But Chengdu is like Shanghai about 5-6 years ago. There's over 100. And then finally, perhaps what I think is the most important imbalance is man-nature. Is really the Chinese have ravaged their environment in the process of industrialization, and it's created enormous ecological imbalances. So what are the Chinese doing to address these imbalances? Some of these are really essentially liberal policy proposals. They are market enhancing, but for the most part, the main policy thrust is one of centralization, standardization, and regulation under state guidance. So this is very different from the debates we're finding in the US. Actually, the United States political economy is at a very crucial threshold as well. But our debate continuously is about government versus market. This is not a debate that is occurring in China. In China, it's about what type of government should we have. Basically, anybody who's lived or knows about Singapore, that is kind of the model the Chinese are pursuing. But Singapore is very small. China is huge. So we'll see how this works. It is to use government in a more effective and concentrated manner. The aim is to revamp, restructure, and ultimately strengthen the state. So this is a continued state capitalist enterprise, but one in which the state itself will have to clip its wings. Basically, the major interest struggles that will occur are interests within the party state. And I'll come to one example. So in a sense, the Chinese Communist Party stands at the center of this reform effort because it will be the central leadership that will have to change the incentives within the system to rebalance the political economy. And the state sector dividend payout policy is really a key example. The Chinese state sector has moved from basically being bankrupt in 1996 to becoming the most profitable state sector anywhere. Roughly last year, the state sector has produced 5% of GDP in profits. That is a lot of money. That's enough to fill more than half of our budget deficit, for example. But the state sector has not given any of these profits to the state, its owner. Rather, the state has allowed them to retain these profits for reinvestment, and that has led to industrial overcapacity. There's a pharmaceutical company in Harbin that has renovated its headquarters. It looks like a Russian palace. Harbin, by the way, has a lot of Russian influence. I mean, you can see corporate show-offs upon corporate show-offs, wasted resources of money everywhere in China. And so the government has decided this is not good. They make so much money, we start to collect dividends. And they have started to collect dividends in 2007 and just upped the rate at which the government is collecting these dividends this year, for this year. But unfortunately, we don't have very reliable statistics. We don't really know how much the Chinese are collecting. And you can imagine this is going to be a real struggle because these big state-owned companies, they're like fiefdoms. They can be quite autonomous. And so you need a lot of political will and a lot of force to basically force them to hand over that money and obviously not engage in accounting gimmicks and other things as corporations everywhere are prone to. Social welfare reforms, medical, pension, unemployment, disability. The Chinese are undertaking what are probably the biggest social welfare reforms ever seen in history. Interestingly, there were various companies like McKinsey, etc., that were trying to sell the Chinese an American medical model. After the financial crisis, the Chinese have decided against it. They're going with Medicare for all. So the purpose of the medical reforms in China is one of a universal social insurance system that insures everybody. But there are big problems. Because if you go and see a doctor for surgery in China, you're well advised to first visit him at his home or at his office, come with a nice fat little packet, red in color, with about 3,000 RMB, which is about $500 US, is the minimum necessary for surgery. Do the same thing with the anesthetician, because he can kill you, as well as the nurses, because they're going to be very important in aftercare. This is a highly corrupt system, and a lot of people's interests are going to be hurt by moving from basically a kind of Guanxi system of receiving money to a regularized system. Urban housing policy reform, another big one. The Chinese are basically building the biggest urban housing scheme ever, historically. This 12 to 5 year plan is looking at 36 million units of public housing. That's enough to house Australia, Spain, France, all put together. Okay? It's enough for a third of the United States, if you look at a family of roughly 3 on average. So, and that's keeping the economy going. Again, a lot of problems there. Industrial upgrading is another big one. Infrastructure remains key. All of these are basically meant to create a form of state refurbishment to guide a socially inclusive political economy. Again, the Singapore model looms large. Might this be the mutual strengthening of state, society, and economy? I remember when I was at UW, I had a directed study course with Joel Migdal, who's somebody who studies Israel. And he believed that state and society are in constant struggle with each other. But he had collaborators who actually made a very sophisticated argument that the process of capitalist development is predicated on the mutual strengthening of government and society and market. And that again ties very much into our discourse in this country, where we always feel it's kind of a zero-sum game. Either the government wins, or society wins, or the market wins. But in reality, I personally, from my own experience, and especially looking at China, believe that sustainable capitalist development is based on a strengthening of government as well as a strengthening of market and society. Indeed, a strong market requires a strong government. Again, go into details, slightly philosophical point, but this is very important because what we're seeing is a CCP-initiated and led project. It is a statist strategy, but to restore better government control, but thereby provide better social services. And perhaps ultimately co-opt new social sectors, especially migrants into the cities, the Chinese kind of blue-collar workers, into being supportive of the party state. Again, Singapore looms very large. I don't think this is going to work, by the way. I think politically, it might work economically and socially, but not politically. So will it be successful? I ask this all of my Chinese colleagues. I'll leave you with this question. Thank you. No, I'm not answering it. Thank you. So I'll stand out here a bit. Any questions, comments, insights, ideas? There's a gentleman right in the front, or is it in the back? Okay.
Thanks very much. You didn't talk much about the seeming problems that China is starting to have, I don't know for how long, with shortages in agricultural commodities to feed their people. For example, the middle class is starting to eat more meat, which requires more feed, which takes that off the tables of other people who are trying to, eat the old style, if you will, of food. And there doesn't seem to be, going forward, enough capacity to make what they need to feed people.
The Chinese have been quite obsessed with the idea of being self-sufficient in food. Quite a few international advisors have told them this is somewhat ridiculous. You have a comparative advantage in people, so grow things like garlic and vegetables that are intensive, and let others, like Brazil, do the soybeans and wheat. Gradually, the Chinese have moved in this direction. They're still obsessed with food security. They're still very much intent of actually keeping the amount of arable land constant. Because one of the problems is not only that the diet has changed, moving more towards meat, protein-rich food that requires a lot of feed, especially soybeans, but also that the Chinese have been losing a lot of the best agricultural land to urbanization. So actually in China, if you want to take agricultural land and make it into urban land, this is a very, very difficult process. And it actually has caused a whole new type of market where villagers nowadays sell their village houses, the land for their village houses, to be converted back to agricultural land. And that creates, like, basically a credit that can be used to develop agricultural land into urban land, further closer to cities. So there's a huge kind of movement going on where villagers are moving into high-rises that are close to the township, the kind of county seat or the township, and the villages then are basically raised and become agricultural land. Oh, la la. What does that mean? So the Chinese government is very much obsessed with that, but basically they've become very big traders in agricultural commodities. They're both big exporters and big importers. Big importers of feed, in particular soybeans and wheat. Less wheat, actually. China's the biggest wheat producer in the world, but especially soybeans. But the government also has set up huge warehouses so that they have some control of the market, meaning that if there's a very bad harvest, the government can release supplies into the market, and when there's a very good harvest, they can buy up these supplies to keep agricultural prices relatively constant. So this is one of the areas where the state-guided system is highly influential and will continue to be so. But there's no doubt that China will become a much bigger international trader in agricultural goods and basically try to produce high value-added goods, agricultural goods in China, and import the very land-intensive and water-intensive goods into China. So thank you very much for that question. Yeah.
So you said that this plan will probably be successful economically, but not necessarily politically. Is that partially due to what some of the other speakers over the past 2 days have said, that the efforts by the leadership are a bit more for show, and they're sort of stunning but not good for depth and quality? Or what's the issue?
No, the issue is basically one of implementation. The Chinese Communist Party seems to have a very Singaporean vision. Basically, again, you have to understand, this is a regime that is exceptionally paranoid. And due to its paranoia, basically fearing social unrest, has become very adaptable in the way it implements policies and has become very foresightful. It has started to think very far ahead. The problem is that they see that as society becomes urbanized, as the middle class grows, there will be much greater demands for civil rights and for political participation. And in a way, the way they'd like to take care of it is the Singapore model. You move a lot of farmers from the countryside into the city, you house them in public housing, you provide them with social services, with state-funded schooling, state-funded job retraining, etc. And then they will become indebted to the Communist Party and become a very large urban support group for the party. That, I think, is the vision. It's not really spelled out, but if you kind of look at it and compare it to other Asian political economies, it's roughly kind of what it seems to be aiming at. But what I think is going to happen is twofold. First of all, China is not Singapore. These policies will not be implemented as cleanly and as efficiently as in Singapore. Already, for example, there's one case in Beijing where they built this kind of huge development in which some housing is private and some is public. The Chinese actually have learned from many American and also European experiences, don't just put public housing together in one place because then you're going to get a ghetto. So mix public and private housing together. The problem is the developer knew this, that they would be making a lot less money on the public housing, and so they built very shoddy public housing and very good private housing. And so the people in public housing, their flats are falling apart while the private ones are looking good. You think this is going to create support for the government? I doubt it. The same thing goes on many other respects. So I think one of the problems is going to be implementation and also the rising of expectations, meaning that the Chinese government is really rising expectations that they're going to have a much more socially inclusive policy. And medical reform in particular will be a very hard nut to crack. It is also in this country. We really can sympathize with the problems the Chinese are facing. And even now, if I talk to friends and relatives in China, they're very unhappy about the medical system. You know, how much drugs cost, you know, the medical care they receive, the corruption underlying everything, etc. And so if the government says, I'm going to reform this, but yet the system remains corrupt because it's very difficult to reform, that will decrease legitimacy. So that's the first part, why I think it's going to be difficult, implementation. The second part, if they're really successful and they really create a much larger urban populace that is somewhat dependent on social services from the government, you will also create people who are much more intent on participating politically and wanting to have a say, what kind of services do they receive, where do they receive them, basically hold the politicians who make these decisions accountable on their behalf. So I think ultimately the policy the Communist Party is pursuing is self-defeating. They're going to create a political base, or they're going to create an economic, socio-economic base for political participation that if they do not allow these people to participate at some point or another, will, you know, you're going to have something happen. What it is, China's like a pressure cooker, so never it's not like India where you have just constant, you know, uprisings and things like that. In China, things can stay calm for a long, long time, and then one spark, and things go off. So thank you very much for that question. Yeah.
Didn't go very well, but anyway, for all kinds of reasons. It was a weird assumption. But anyway, I took them to the mall. We took them to the mall, and they wanted to find something that was made in the USA to take back to their families. And we thought it was kind of an easy project, and it turned out to be really excruciating. And they got really obsessed about it. And eventually, in the Flourishine shoe shop, they found one rounder of belts that all said made in the USA, and they bought them all up and took them home. So now that you're giving us this concept of Sino-Capitalism, it made me wonder, does it carry that, like Nike, Gucci, I've got to have this thing, which is kind of antithetical to communism in terms of its presentation. So how does that add up or work out? Or
First of all, thank you very much for using the term Sino-Capitalism. You know, you always want to put out a brand, you know, talking about branding. So, you know, Sino-Capitalism is kind of a brand that I want to push, hopefully associate it with my name at some point. But your question comes back to Andrea's question a bit, actually, and it was a very, very crucial point that I didn't mention when answering Andrea's question, which is that China has become ultra materialist. I mean, materialism beyond anything that even Japan saw. And that's already, you know, brand consciousness kind of driven to an extreme. The Chinese, obviously there are counter movements. I've met young people who've moved out of the city up into areas populated by Tibetans and opened a cafe and just want to get out of the rat race and are as anti-materialistic as you can find. But for the most part, young Chinese are extremely brand conscious. And it is very much a country predicated upon materialism and consumerism. And it's very interesting how you say this flies in the face of communism. You know, the Beijing municipal government recently declared that certain types of advertising should not be put out because they're too materialistic. But it's a joke. It's an absolute joke. It just contributes to this rise in cynicism, because there is nowadays, I would say, no other country in the world that is that crassly materialistic and status conscious as a result. I just give you an example. My sister-in-law works in a radio station. These radio stations are all state-owned, all the media is. She works in the marketing department. About 2 years ago, the marketing department decided that their marketing people needed to have cars that would represent the company and be according. And so they gave her a very, very low interest loan to buy at least an Audi. Audi, Mercedes, BMW, Lexus. Nothing below that. The company also buys Gucci handbags and Prada handbags on behalf of their staff. I mean, this is a degree of status consciousness driven, you know, it becomes corporate policy. You cannot come to work unless you have an LV bag. France is making out like a bandit. The Louis Vuitton store on the Champs-Élysées has now 50% Chinese employees and has lines out. I have told people in Hawaii, if you do advertising in China, don't show the beaches, don't show the volcano, don't show hula dancers. Show them Ala Moana Mall, okay? It's the biggest open-air mall in the United States. It's got a wonderful selection of brand name goods, and it's cheaper than anything in China. I mean, I can go on and on and on. I mean, also the income inequalities in China are so crass that it's like Brazil. It's sickening. It really is sickening. You know, people buying expensive furnitures and villas and cars while you just go like a kilometer away and you have people that are still just barely scrapping by on subsistence. And the arrogance of the rich that we see everywhere is very palpable. So that is another part of the identity that kind of the Chinese government, that's why you've got the New Left in China. The New Left is a group of younger, actually people who believe very strongly in social democracy with an authoritarian tinge. And the Communist Party both likes them because they kind of reinforce part of the socialist creed, but they're also very scared of them because they're very actually critical of what the Chinese Communist Party has done, which is basically create a state technocrat capital alliance. That's what China is. It's an alliance of the rich with technocrats, with communists in one bed. So it's a weird amalgam, and you see all kinds of new tensions emerging in this, leading to new identities. But right now, we're still full force in you know, the heyday of materialism, consumerism. I mean, I don't want to live in China. One of the reasons is just the gift-giving culture. You need to do it. You know, somebody in, sorry, Peter, I'm taking away from your time, but this might be a nice segue into something more cultural. There's a guy called Fu Shi, who lives in Changsha, which is in Hunan, it's in the middle of China. And he just wrote a book on basically how to conduct guanxi. And he said, look, in our system, cultivating interpersonal relations, giving gifts is a must. Otherwise, you lose out. There's some people who do it really well, and therefore they're successful, and there are others who don't do it well. And so now I'm going to teach the people who don't do it well how to do it. And he has lists of how much money is required for every government service and for every single doctor and things like that. And how do you give the money? When do you give it? I mean, it's basically a handbook of how to navigate that system, and now obviously a lot of, I think it's going to be translated into English very soon because it's useful. I mean, but for someone like me, this is really difficult, even more so because I grew up in Switzerland, which is a very anti-gift-giving culture, to put it mildly. It's a very stingy culture. And the Chinese, everything, I mean, you've got people, they go to Hong Kong, they have a seafood meal for 10,000 bucks. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous stuff that goes on there. And for me, it makes me slightly sick, not just the seafood, but, you know, the money. So I'll end with that. Thank you so much.